In the British Museum, there is a small tablet dated to approximately 165 years before the Common Era. It comes from Uruk, one of the oldest cities of Mesopotamia. The text on it is written in Akkadian. In the museum catalogue, it is listed under the designation BM 35404. This tablet does not appear in textbooks. It is rarely mentioned in popular books on Sumerology. But for every specialist in cuneiform, it is one of the most unusual texts to have come down from ancient Mesopotamia, because what is written on it is the following: a list, in 2 columns. On the left, the names of kings. On the right, the names of their sage advisors. 8 antediluvian rulers are enumerated, the same ones we know from the Sumerian king list in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. But next to each king stands the name of his sage. 7 sages for 8 kings, because the last of the sages died before the last king took the throne. These 7 sages are called by a single word in the Akkadian tradition, Apkallu, which means sages of the waters. And then come 2 phrases that have turned this tablet into a puzzle that several generations of Assyriologists are still working through today. The first phrase, they carried the full mind. This is the formula used to describe the mind of the gods, not of humans. Not, they were wise. Not, they knew a great deal. They carried the full mind, the same expression used in other texts to describe the gods themselves. The second phrase, written of the sages who came after the flood, 2/3 of them were beings of the Apsu. That is, the post-flood sages were only partially what the antediluvian ones had been. They had diminished. They had become less. This is the description of a decline. Something was lost at the moment of the flood, and what was lost did not come back. To understand what this means, we need to first look at who the Apkallu are and where they came from. The tradition of the Apkallu is one of the oldest organizing principles in Sumerian and Akkadian thought about the past. According to this tradition, before the flood destroyed the old world, humanity passed through a sequence of ages under the guidance of 7 supernatural sages. Each sage brought knowledge. Each sage is connected to a specific king and a specific city. Each city is a separate phase of civilization. The first of the Apkallu is called Uana. He is connected to Alulim of Eridu, the first king on the Sumerian king list. The text describes Uana like this: he emerged from the sea, came to people, and from him humans learned writing, mathematics, architecture, and law. This is literally a description of the transmission of civilizational knowledge. Uana is the same Oannes that in the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Babylonian priest Berosus described as a being from the Persian Gulf who gave humanity civilization. The second Apkallu is Uana-Duga. He is connected to Alalgar, the 2nd king of Eridu. The 3rd is Enmeduga. The 4th is Enmegalama. The 5th is Enmebuluga. The 6th is An-Enlilda. The 7th is Utuabzu, the last of the antediluvian sages, the one who served just before the flood. 7 sages, 7 ages, 7 successive transmissions of knowledge. And then, the flood, a reset. But here is a detail that is almost never mentioned. Each of the 7 Apkallu had its own specific domain of knowledge. The first, Uana, brought writing, mathematics, architecture, and law. This is not a vague wisdom, it is a specific list. The second Apkallu added astronomy, the 3rd, medicine, the 4th, methods of irrigation, the 5th, shipbuilding, the 6th, metalworking, the 7th, art. This is not a list of magical abilities, it is a list of infrastructural knowledge, everything necessary for a functioning civilization, an engineering package, delivered in installments, by 7 successive bearers, across 7 successive ages. If this is a literal history, civilization was built gradually, one technological package at a time, under the guidance of each new sage. If it is metaphor, behind it stands a precise understanding of which kinds of knowledge a civilization requires, and in what order they arrive. For a society of the 17th century before the Common Era, this is a strikingly systematic view of the history of technology. Think about what this means. If you read these texts literally, the way the Sumerian and Akkadian scribes themselves read them, Then before the flood, there existed at least 7 successive civilizational phases. Each phase had its carrier of knowledge. Each phase had its ruler. Each phase had its capital. The Sumerian king list from Oxford names 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Uruk, Sippar, Shuruppak. But the very first line of the list says, "When kingship descended from heaven, it was at Eridu." This means that Eridu is the moment civilization's record begins. But the kingship descended from something. From what, the text does not say. It simply notes that there was a moment of beginning. So what we have is a primordial period before the record begins, a first phase. Eridu, the second. Bad Tabira, the third. Uruk, the fourth. Sippar, the fifth. Shuruppak, the sixth. The flood. Then our post-flood world. 6 phases before us. We are perhaps the 7th. This is not a statement. It is a question that the texts themselves open before us, if we read them as a coherent body rather than as scattered myths. And here I want to pause and address you directly. If any of you have read the Sumerian king list in full, not summaries, but the actual translation, write to me in the comments. What was your impression? Because almost everyone who reads it for the first time describes the same feeling, that it does not read like myth, that it reads like a report. And one more thing, the tablet I mentioned at the start, the Uruk list of kings and sages, BM 35404, is accessible in the open catalogues of the British Museum. The translation has been published in academic literature. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard analyzed it in 1939 in his foundational study, The Sumerian King List. W.G. Lambert published research on the Apkallu tradition in the 1960s and 70s. None of this is secret or classified. It simply rarely makes it into popular accounts. Now I want to approach this from a different angle, not from the side of a specific tablet, but from the side of structure. Sumerian and Akkadian texts, read together, describe one and the same basic story about how the past is organized. It goes like this. The gods first established the order of the world. Then they create humans. Humans receive knowledge through intermediaries, the Apkallu. Civilization flourishes, passes from city to city. It reaches some kind of limit. Then a catastrophe destroys it entirely. Then, from a surviving remnant, civilization begins again. This is the description of a cycle. Not just a story about a flood, it is the description of a mechanism. Notice a detail that is easy to miss. In the Epic of Atrahasis, one of the main Mesopotamian texts about the flood, the gods attempt to destroy humanity 3 times. First with plague, then with drought, then with flood. Only the 3rd attempt succeeds. This is not 3 separate events. It is 3 successive attempts at a reset, with different intensities, with different outcomes. If such an attempt occurred at least 3 times within the span of one text, how many times had it occurred before the text began? The Sumerian king list tells us it happened at least once, what we call the flood, which the list describes as the end of the antediluvian era and the beginning of ours. But the list does not begin at the beginning of the world. It begins at the moment when kingship descended from heaven, which means there was a point from which the record starts. What came before that point? Silence. There is another Akkadian text that is rarely mentioned in this context. It is called the Poem of Era. Era is the Akkadian god of war and pestilence. In this text, Era destroys cities and civilizations, systematically, as if this were his job. The text was written around the 8th century before the Common Era. In it, there is a line that in direct translation reads, "Where are now the great works that you did in the past?" Meaning, they have disappeared. Nothing remains of them. Future generations will live without knowing what came before them. This is a rhetorical question addressed to a god, but it presupposes exactly what we are discussing: preceding ages from which nothing remains, destruction as a systematic process, and future people who will not know. The Akkadian term for what existed before the recorded, Lamu, that which came before. This word appears at the beginning of Enuma Elish, the main Babylonian creation poem. When above, the heavens were not yet named, when below the earth was not yet called by name. This is not nothing. This is a condition from which something emerges, before which something was. This idea that our civilization is not the first is not peripheral to Sumerian and Akkadian thought. It is structurally foundational. The world in which these people live is the post-flood world. They know this. They remember the names of the 7 sages of the antediluvian world. They remember the names of the 8 antediluvian kings. They remember the 5 cities. They do not think that history began with them. We think that history began with us. Compare this with other traditions that independently speak of the same thing. Plato in the dialogue Timaeus, a text of the 4th century before the Common Era, passes on the story of an Egyptian priest speaking to the Greek sage Solon. "You Greeks are always children. No Greek is old. You do not remember any ancient tradition, any knowledge that is grayed with time." The priest explains this by the fact that the Greeks had survived several catastrophes, each time losing their memory. In Egypt, he says, the memory was preserved longer. This is not mythology. It is a social theory in the mouth of a Platonic character. Civilizations get erased. Memory is lost. Then it starts again. The Indian tradition divides time into 4 yugas: Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali. Our epoch, Kali Yuga, is the last and the most degraded. Before it were 3 higher epochs. After Kali Yuga, a new cycle. This is not a description of the creation of the world. It is a description of the rhythm of the world. Cycle after cycle. These traditions did not borrow from each other. Between Mesopotamia of the 4th millennium before the Common Era and India of the 1st millennium before the Common Era, there is no direct documented channel for the transmission of the idea of civilizational cycles. And yet, the structure is the same. Several ages. Degradation from one to the next. A reset. Beginning again. Berosus, the Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, passes on the following account. Before the flood, the Babylonians inscribed all their knowledge on clay tablets and buried them in Sippar, the sacred city of the sun god. After the flood, the survivors found those tablets and recovered the knowledge. This is the description of deliberate archiving before an end. If Berosus was drawing on a real tradition, and he was, since in his time there were still Babylonian priests with access to original archives, then someone before the flood knew the flood was coming, and tried to preserve a trace. We have already seen this story. Enki speaking to a wall to warn Ziusudra, the instructions of Shurupak transmitted across the flood, the tablets buried in Sippar. One and the same theme. Someone knows about the end. Someone tries to preserve something on the other side of it. One such case is a cultural peculiarity of one tradition. 2 is a parallel. 3 or more independent traditions with the same structure. That is already a question about what lies behind that structure. There is one more connection that is rarely noticed. Gilgamesh, the hero of the greatest Sumerian epic, is described as 2/3 god, 1/3 human. Exactly that formula. 2/3, 3/3. This is the same mathematics as the description of the post-flood Apkallu. 2/3 of them were of the Apsu. The decline from full to 2/3. Gilgamesh searches for immortality. He does not find it. He returns to Uruk and looks at the walls of his city, and there is something unutterably melancholy in this, if you understand the context. He knows there was another world, where the Apkallu carried the full mind. He lives in a world where the mind is already partial. He tries to recover what cannot be recovered. Let us return to the tablet BM 35404. The list of 7 Apkallu ends just before the flood. After the flood, there is a continuation, an enumeration of post-flood sages. Their names are different. Their description is different. They no longer carry the full mind. They are half of the Apsu, half of the earth. This is a direct indication that something changed qualitatively. Not just an epoch changed. The type of being that carries knowledge changed. In the Sumerian text Adapa, a man is described who served Enki in Eridu and was summoned to the heavens before the god Anu. Adapa is the first of the Apkallu, the first bearer of civilizational knowledge. When he was in the sky, he was offered the food of immortality. Enki had warned him beforehand, "Do not eat this food." Adapa did not eat it, and he returned mortal. This is the description of a moment when the full mind and immortality were close and remained on the other side. If the antediluvian Apkallu carried the full mind and the post-flood ones carry 2/3, what do we carry? Through how many successive diminutions has knowledge passed before it reached us? And here is a question that modern science asks itself. How far back in the past can we actually see traces of organized human activity? The answer is constrained not by the amount of research, it is constrained by geology. Most traces of human activity are destroyed in a few thousand years. Wooden structures, in centuries. Metal objects dissolve in the ground. Clay tablets are paradoxically durable if fired, but stone cities are buried under sediment. Coastlines change. Rivers change their courses. If an organized civilization had existed 200,000 years ago, almost nothing would remain that we could recognize. This does not mean it was not there. It means that our historical horizon is limited not by the past, but by the durability of materials. The Sumerian texts say, "There was another system of knowledge, more complete than ours. It was lost at the catastrophe." The post-flood world received only part of what existed before it. Is this the description of a geological gap in the record, a period from which nothing survives? Or is it pure mythology? I do not know the answer. I do not think anyone does. I know something else. The tablet is in the British Museum with an open catalogue. The Apkallu tradition is documented by Jacobson in 1939 and by Lambert in the 1960s. The Sumerian king list from Oxford describes 5 successive antediluvian centers, plus a primordial period before them. The Akkadian tradition adds 7 phases of sages. Analogous structures independently appear in Egyptian, Greek, and Indian traditions. Berosus documents the deliberate archiving of knowledge before the flood. The poem of Era describes destruction of civilizations as a systematic process. And between all of these facts, no one whose job it is to draw the line is drawing it. The tablets exist. The Apkallu tradition is documented. The cycle structure is recorded. The question is open. The question of how many times the world was organized, destroyed, and rebuilt before the Sumerian scribe wrote down the name of Alulim of Eridu has been open since Thorkild Jacobson published the first detailed academic analysis of the king list in 1939. It is open today. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, the Apkallu list in the British Museum is only one page of a very long document about what came before us. Maybe I will see you in the next one.